When we look closer, in November 18, we have a policy question. Then again, June 18, we looked at basically a question that wasn't really to do with policies, but 17 June, there was a policy question. Then we have a 16 May policy question again, and November 16, both policy questions came. So the first part will be basically to cover policies because policies are very likely to come. But first, let's look at 3A, which talks about explain how the rate of deflation is measured and the impact of a period of deflation on the economy. So what is deflation? Deflation is basically falling basically price level, right? In a deflation, prices are going down, and we say this, that deflation can be measured. We measure it just like inflation, we measure it through CPI, Consumer Price Index. You may not need to talk about too much about how we calculate, but you talk about CPI in a Consumer Price Index. You can briefly mention there is a base here. We construct a basket of goods and assign weights. To ultimately get ourselves basically what we call average price level. Okay. Why am I saying this is not going to be too much of a discussion? In fact, if you look at examiner marking scheme, he hasn't really talked about focusing too much on CPI, because what is more important is the second part, which is the impact of a period of deflation on the economy. So what is the effect of deflation in the economy? So effects of deflation. This is from our notes. If you go back to our notes, we have a discussion about when your price level is going down. This happens because AD is falling. A falling AD basically means a couple of things. Number one, low consumer confidence. Consumer confidence is low because prices are going down, so demand is falling, which is basically causing consumer confidence to be low. Number two, because consumer confidence is low and GDP is declining, because you remember AD is going down, so GDP will fall. If you draw a diagram, we're looking at this kind of a diagram. If this is AD and AS, so we're looking at AD to fall, right? So there is a fall in price level because of this. Now, low consumer confidence, which leads to low basically business confidence, because firms are finding demand to cut down, which will mean that investment will further fall, which will cause again AD to fall, and therefore an economy to what we say suffer from recession. Economic downturn or recession may happen, right? Number three, we said because there's a low consumer confidence and business confidence, there are other effects that can also happen. Unemployment will go up in this economy, so there will be a lower living standard because of such fall of AD. We also said this, that from the perspective when the prices are going down, a lower price level means that lenders in this case versus borrowers, the borrowers will lose out now. So borrowers, like firms that have borrowed, borrowers will lose out. Why? Because price level is going down, so the real value of debt, the loans that you've taken, is going up. You know, when your interest rate is like 10%, but inflation rate is like minus 5%, so you're effectively paying 15% of your money in terms of loans. Your rate is not 10% but 15%, because you add the minus 5%, right? Some positives as well, just to talk about impact ki baat ho rahi hai. Some positives that we mentioned in our notes were, if the price level is going down, we mentioned a couple of points. Number one was basically your price level goes down, your X minus M may go up. As price of exports is going down, price of imports will be relatively higher, so net exports may go up. Makes sense? Also, number two, because price level is going down, maybe savers may benefit. just as a point of discussion here. Are we good? Does that make sense? So that's the first part, which is basically impact of deflation in an economy. Deflation is falling AD, which is where the AD is going down. Okay, now we come to the B part, which is analyze how fiscal and monetary policy could be used to solve the problem of deflation. So I want to talk about fiscal and monetary policy from our notes perspective, from our revision videos perspective. The last three videos, second last, 39th, 40th and 41st is a very important discussion. Jisme we talked about how to control inflation, supply side policies, and so on. So let's talk about fiscal and monetary policy used to solve the problem of deflation. So in a deflation situation, first we will mention that when you are looking at deflation, we want our AD to rise. So what kind of policies that we can do? We can do what we call demand side policies, right? So we will do what we call demand side policies. When we look at demand side policies would be, in this case, because we want AD to go up, we will say we want to have expansionary fiscal policy and expansionary monetary policy. Okay, what is expansionary fiscal policy? Let's talk about that first. Expansionary fiscal policy is basically using the tool right now. Fiscal policy is using the tool of taxation, taxes, and government expenditure. Right? In this case, what I'm going to do, because I want my AD to go up, I will reduce taxes. When I reduce taxes, what happens to disposable income? Income after tax or disposable income will go up. And that rise in disposable income will result in consumption to rise because people have more income. But because you're also going to have lower profit tax, lower income tax, the investment can also go up, which can further make the AD to go up, and therefore the economy to recover its AD. On the other hand, government expenditure, the way government expenditure works is that we are trying to basically increase government expenditure, which is, remember, AD is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So AD will go up in this case. And we move to what about monetary policy? In the monetary policy, we are changing what we call our money supply. So when the money supply goes up, our interest rates goes down. And this fall of interest rate will have an effect on basically cost of borrowing and our incentive to save. Cost of borrowing when your interest rates are going down will go down because it's cheaper to borrow now. Incentive to save will also go down because the return from saving is going down. Both of this will result in consumption to go up as people will now find it cheaper to borrow, and also people do not find it, there is lower incentive to save. Investment will also go up, causing AD to go up. So this is where we use our expansionary monetary policy. So the first part of the question is talking about how do we make the AD go up, and the next part of the discussion is basically which policy is likely to be effective, which is basically your discussion about fiscal and monetary policy as tools to manage AD. So what are the pros and cons of fiscal and monetary policy? So there are a lot to write. Let me just quickly give all the points. Any questions before we move on? That I'm going to talk about both fiscal and monetary policy. Some of the common points that we want to talk about is that both the expansionary policies are politically popular, especially your fiscal policy, where G goes up or T goes down, the effect on poor people is likely to be stronger. You know why? Because government expenditure can be directly sort of affecting the poor. So you are affecting the poor much more, and this can result in government support to go up. So government support can go up mainly because when you look at fiscal policy affects the poor more than the rich. For example, unemployment benefits or other government expenditure is likely to impact the poor much more. Also, the problem that we only face sometimes with these policies, you can write second point, is that both policies can have potential delays in showing impact. For example, fiscal policy takes much longer to get approved and implemented, while monetary policy is only effective when people respond to changes in interest rates. What do we mean by this? If I'm a person, when the interest rate goes down, I don't consume more or invest more, then basically monetary policy will be useless. Sometimes people are so concerned about other factors that even the interest rate go up, they may not react to it. For example, in Pakistan, if the interest rate goes down, and people right now are not so confident in terms of the economy, will they spend more? And the answer is no. Consumer confidence and business confidence is low, so they might end up not reacting to lower interest rates.
Can you also mention how monetary can't be used if you're operating a fixed exchange?
Yes, and the third point is basically in a fixed exchange rate system, we use monetary policy to manage exchange rate. So fiscal policy can be more useful. And last point I can sort of add here is basically you can talk about how that both fiscal and monetary policy have policy conflicts with other goals. Example, price level falls, GDP may go up, but we also saw this that they could be because right now, price level goes up. Price level is going. You want the deflation. You want AD to go up, right? So you're making the AD to go up, but that is causing price level to go up. So there could be a problem that while you are trying to achieve economic growth and while you're trying to lower unemployment, there could be a problem of inflationary pressure that can happen in the economy. In this case, it's not a big stress because we are struggling from deflation, but there could be a policy conflict otherwise. And that's why probably in the long run, supply side policies are found to be more desirable. So between fiscal and monetary policy, you will say that probably fiscal policy is politically more popular, and in a fixed exchange rate regime, probably we're likely to more likely to use fiscal policy rather than monetary policy. Are we good? Does that make sense? Can I go back to the questions now? Yeah. So if you look at the questions now, a lot of questions will try to sort of ask us the same kind of question. So look at this one, June 17. Explain the difference between fiscal and monetary policy. We know this. Show how each can be used to increase AD. That's the same kind of a question. And then they say B part, discuss whether supply side policy is more likely to be useful than fiscal policy when economy is faced with inflation. So supply side policies versus fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is demand side policy. And demand side policy, you can talk about demand side policy is useful to look at demand pull inflation. While if you have inflation which is cost push, maybe supply side policy could be useful. Makes sense? But what exactly is supply side policy? Let's first talk about that. We know what fiscal policy is. We can talk about that. But first supply side policy, and then let's talk about evaluation for this question. Okay? First look at the supply side policies. What are supply side policies? We said supply side policies are policies which are trying to increase productivity, competition, we said, and innovation in an economy, while at the same time causing price level to fall. So keeping price level to fall, we are trying to basically increase productivity, competition, innovation, efficiency in an economy. How do we do that? Well, we do that by making the aggregate supply curve shift to the right so that the cost goes down. Make sense? This is real GDP. And this is price level. Make sense? So when we look at supply side policies, these are the policies that are designed towards making our aggregate supply curve shift to the right in an economy. Any questions? The first thing you can mention about in terms of policies, you can talk about privatization. When you privatize your nationally government-owned resources, profitability becomes the motive that results in efficiency to go up. Number two would be deregulation. Deregulation is basically lowering barriers to entry so that we can increase competition in the market by having more competition. So for example, if Mobilink and Envirus have become one single sort of entity, if that is causing basically a lot of other firms to suffer because they've become a big monopoly, you break them down. You do not approve of their coming together. You could tell them to go back and become two firms rather than one firm. So deregulation could be one. Number three could be reducing taxes and reducing unemployment benefits. Why do you do that? Because when you reduce taxes, you allow more investment to happen, you allow more people to work. By reducing unemployment benefits, you are also allowing basically incentive for working to go up, because if there's too high unemployment benefits, you may end up people basically not working. Similarly, there is expenditure on education, training, and even better infrastructure. So a paragraph should be spent in terms of writing about what supply side policies are and how they can make the aggregate demand curve, the aggregate supply curve shift to the right. Now, what are the advantages and disadvantages? Is that what we need to discuss now? We know what fiscal policy is. We'll talk about how fiscal policy is on that. Then there comes a discussion about these policies. So first point that you will talk about in terms of evaluation is basically if it's demand pull inflation, then we should normally use what we call demand side policy, which is basically your fiscal policy or monetary policy, in this case fiscal, for example. Then if it's cost push, you should use supply side. Make sense? If it's cost push and I use demand side policy, what will be the harm you can talk about is this, that if the inflation is cost push and I end up using demand side fiscal policy, it will be really bad. Because look at this, guys, what will happen? If this was AD and AS and there was a cost push inflation, AS curve shifts backward and we end up using fiscal policy. Fiscal policy will make the AD go down, which would mean GDP will keep on declining in this economy. So that is where we should be very careful as to knowing the cause and therefore using the right kind of policy. Use fiscal policy only when there is a demand side inflation or demand pull inflation. Okay, number one. Number two is this, that there is no policy conflict for supply side policy. But for demand side policy, if you look at your AD, if you make your AD go down, let's say inflation may, when you make your AD go down, there is a possibility that although the price level will go down, but your GDP will also fall from Y0 to Y1. So unemployment can go up and GDP will go down in a contractionary fiscal policy. So that's a disadvantage of that. The downside of supply side policy, so supply side policy sort of downsides are, number one, it's costly. Number two, it can work only in the long run. We're costly because we're spending so much money in terms of education, training, and so on and so forth. So it will be costly, which means there's an opportunity cost as well as a lot of money will be required. But also it only works in the long run. It's not going to work in the short run. Fiscal policy can be relatively quicker. However, it will be deeply unpopular and has other issues like, for example, conflict with other policies and so on. So there is a challenge on those lines. So that's a good answer for our question about comparing fiscal and monetary. The part that I did not write here is basically, I've discussed it just earlier, which is that you need to talk about fiscal policy as well. You know, like fiscal policy, how it works. We are trying to make the AD fall. You can do that by increasing government expenditure, reducing taxes, and that will cause my AD to fall. Okay, so that's two sides of the policies. Reducing government expenditure and increasing taxes. I'm still stuck in the last question. Reducing government expenditure and increasing taxes to reduce AD. Sorry, makes sense. So this is what we call contractionary policy. When you look at policy conflicts, when you look at this diagram, right, there are four goals that we have, four macroeconomic goals. The first goal is basically, let's say, unemployment. Second one is low inflation. The third one would be GDP, growth in GDP. And the fourth one is balance of payment. Right? So when you're trying to keep your price level low, you will make the AD fall. A fall in AD means GDP will fall. So GDP falls, right? But that would mean also unemployment goes up. So goal number 2, let's call it number 2. This goal is conflict with the first goal and the third goal. And also remember, balance of payment, how do we get ourselves to improve our balance of payment? We use what we call contractionary, fiscal, and monetary policy. Remember, this is what we call expenditure dampening policy. So expenditure dampening policy can help us achieve not only balance of payment improvement, but also can help us achieve low inflation, but may be harmful for unemployment and GDP. Unemployment goes up when the AD goes down. So when your AD is going down to control price level, you are basically not achieving all the goals. That's not the problem with supply side policies, because in supply side policies, look at this, guys, your aggregate supply curve is shifting to the right. Where is my graph? Yeah, your aggregate supply curve is shifting to the right. Not only price level goes down, GDP goes up, unemployment goes down, and also balance of payment will also improve. Why would balance of payment improve? Because in this case, when the price level goes down, exports become cheaper, imports become expensive, relatively X minus M goes up. Supply side policies help us achieve all the 4 goals in the economy, though they will take much longer to show its effect. Like, will you explain what is inflation and all that? No, you don't. Like inflation, you can just talk about how inflation is a rising price level, that's all. And that can happen because of both demand side and supply side. For demand side, we can use demand pull inflation, we could use demand side policies and so on. Okay. I want to move on to this question, which is basically it's June 16. Explain using examples. Using example, explain the instruments of monetary and supply side policies. Easy, right? Discuss the advantages and disadvantages of supply side policy and consider its effectiveness in the economy that is facing labor shortages. Now, let's talk about labor shortages because this part is important. Advantages and disadvantages sorted. Let's talk about when you have a labor shortage, what will happen in the economy? Anyone? Good job. So what kind of inflation will we suffer from? Cost push. Very good. So when there is a labor shortage, we can talk about how it could be a situation where the aggregate supply curve will shift backward and there will be higher price level, and therefore we are looking at a situation where I would say use supply side policies, because otherwise the economy is not going to come over its labor shortages that will happen. And then talk about advantages of supply side policies and disadvantages. Advantages are many. Look at the video that we have about how it can reduce inflation, about how it can create more jobs, about how it doesn't have any conflict with any other policy, and so on. And the disadvantages is that it takes much longer, it is expensive to implement, and sometimes it is also unpopular, because when you are reducing unemployment benefits and then poor people may not like it initially, but in the long run it can help us sort of structure the economy better. Okay, so that's an answer for this one. So as far as I'm concerned, preparing policies is a really important kind of a thing, because it's very likely to come in our exam. Make sense? Look at 2 questions that are similar. One is this one, which is explain what is meant by the term money and outline its characteristics. And then we look at this one, explain what is used as money in modern economy, and how an increase in the quantity of money can cause price level to go up. So we need to know the definition of what money is, and we need to know the functions of money, the characteristics of money, and how an increase in money can cause inflation to happen. So when you're looking at this kind of a question, we're looking at first part, which is more to do with micro. हमने कहा था कि what is money? Money is basically defined as a medium of exchange, right? And it could be notes and coins. It could also be bank deposits. In fact, the concept of liquidity comes here, where we talk about how any liquid assets is one that can easily be converted into money, which is money or near money items that can be used as a medium of exchange. So what are the characteristics of money? Characteristics of money could be portable, acceptable, divisible, and then there was like limited in supply, durable, and uniform, so that it's difficult to forge. So you can talk about those features. Talk about so acceptable. I'm writing it in the wrong place. We said acceptable, uniform, limited in supply. Just 1 minute. limited in supply, uniform. We also said that it should be what else? Portable and divisible. Portable and divisible. Did I miss any? And durable, long lasting. Okay, so that's what it is. So money is anything which is easily accepted as a medium of exchange. It could be notes and coins, it could be deposits, or it could be any near money or liquid asset. Liquid assets are those assets which can be easily converted into money. Make sense? Okay. Now we talk about what are the functions of money. Just to quickly talk about this as well. So functions of money is basically a medium of exchange, right? It is also as a unit of account. What is unit of account? Unit of account is basically we are able to look at goods or measure the value of goods through money. So that's what it's unit of account. The third one was store of value. Store of value is basically we could save in terms of money. If you want to not spend today, we can spend tomorrow because by using money. So unit of account's other name is also measure of value. Sometimes MCQs will show you measure of value, sometimes it's unit of account. And the last one is standard of deferred payment, which is basically use it to pay later. Like for example, I can borrow today and I can return the loan tomorrow. That's what it is. So when inflation is happening, how can these functions get affected? Well, if the price level is going up in an economy, then basically can money be used as a medium of exchange? And we say this, that your purchasing power goes down. Purchasing power goes down, and as a result of this, money does not serve as a medium of exchange effectively because we lose our purchasing power. So a lot of people sometimes find it difficult to buy goods and services from the same money that they have because money is losing its value. The second one is that in inflation, when the prices are rapidly increasing, it's difficult to look at the value of a good and figure out its unit of account, because a lot of times things becomes expensive, so it's not a good measure of value. So that could also happen. The third one is that borrowers may not want to save in money, in fact in something else which does not get affected in inflation. Borrowers lose out in inflation, and that's why it's not a good store of value. Make sense? Then comes standard of deferred payments. The standard of deferred payments is, for example, like wages. I get paid at the end of the month, but my work happens throughout the month. But when inflation is happening, what will happen to real wages? Your purchasing power will go down. Your money wages will not give you the same amount of goods and services anymore. So as a function of standard of deferred payment, that also gets affected because prices will affect your money wages will lose purchasing power. Okay, so if we go back to the question is saying us discuss whether money is able to perform all its function effectively in an economy that is experienced, and the answer is no, it will not be able to affect it. It will not be able to sort of fulfill its role. In your conclusion, you can give an answer basically how badly will these functions be affected depends on the rate of inflation. Whether the rate of inflation is very high, then these functions will be significantly effective. And also sometimes we can use things like indexation and other things that can somehow help us in reducing this cost of inflation. However, it will still remain, although not that high, if we can do indexation. Okay, are we good to move on? Okay, now I want to move on to now something similar that came earlier. So what is basically uses money? Let's talk about this part now. Explain what is money in a modern economy and how an increase in the quantity of money can cause price to rise. So this is basically what we look at is the third inflation, which is called monetary inflation. What is monetary inflation? Monetary inflation is basically when the money supply goes up, it will cause basically, there are two explanations to it. I'll give both the explanations here because in my answer I should give both the explanations. When money supply goes up, we say this, that there is extra liquidity in the market causing money supply to be greater than money demand, people have more supply of money than demanded, that will cause the AD to rise, and that in turn will cause price level to rise if the economy doesn't have the spare capacity to meet the increased demand. Let me write this as well, it's a good line to write. If the economy doesn't have the spare capacity to meet the increased demand. So you got to talk about that. But in this, examiners love when you talk about the quantity theory of money, which is MV equals to PT. Do mention that as well. That according to the quantity theory of money, MV equals to PT, where M is your money supply, your V is velocity or number of time money is changing hands, P is your price level, and T is your quantity or output. So when MV is equal to PT, when you look at MV equals to PT, when your according to the monitors, they say this, that V and T are constant. Why are they constant? Because they say V is your spending pattern. Although it's velocity, number of time money is changing hand, it's actually a spending pattern. The reason why money change hand is because you have a spending pattern. And that spending pattern doesn't change too often. It will only change in the long run. 2 years at A levels, your spending pattern remains the same. Then you go to college, 4 years, your spending pattern will remain the same. Make sense? So people do not have a significant change in spending pattern, so spending pattern doesn't change, which means V doesn't change in the short term. Also, T doesn't change in the short term because T is your quantity of output, which depends on factors of production, and that is also not changing too often. So if V and T are not changing, which means that we can remove them from the equation, whenever money supply goes up, it automatically directly makes the price level go up. So you talk about how, according to the quantity theory of money, whenever money supply goes up, price level goes up because V and T are constant in the short run, and that's what we call is our monetarist view. According to the monetarist school of thought, they believe that this is how things work. Now I'm going to move on to look at, are we copying this? Okay, done? Okay. To look at this question, which is kind of like to do with inflation, because we are discussing inflation. This one, explain how high rate of inflation and rise in economy's exchange rate can each cause a deficit in the current account or the balance of payment. So first we'll explain what is the deficit, what is the current account. Current account of the balance of payment is the account that has basically X minus M of goods and services, that has income section, that has current transfers. Make sense? Is there anything else in it? Income section, current transfers, and net X minus M of goods and services, right? And you can say this, that inflation is a rise in price level, so explain that. And exchange rate is the value of one country's currency expressed in the form of another currency. So when the price level goes up, we notice exports become expensive, imports become cheaper, and that basically, if Marshall-Lerner condition is true, or rather you should not, if you don't want to mention this, if X and M are elastic, then we'll see X minus M to go down because exports become expensive, imports become cheaper, and X minus M will go down. Got it? So you explain this idea that high rate of inflation can make exports expensive, so quantity of exports will fall because elastic by much more, and imports becomes cheaper. Quantity of imports will rise because elastic by much more. So exports are going down, imports are going up, and therefore X minus M goes down. So that will cause a deficit in the current account or the balance of payment. Make sense? Similarly, if the exchange rate goes up, then also exports become expensive, imports become cheaper, and if Marshall-Lerner condition is true, which also is the same thing, exports and imports are elastic, PED of exports plus PED of imports is greater than 1, if they are elastic, then again X minus M will go down. So talk about both the factors of how when your exchange rate goes up, exports become expensive, imports become cheaper, and that causes your X minus M to go down, given exports and imports as a sum is elastic, and also when the inflation goes up, X minus M will fall. Explain whether a high rate of inflation or a deficit on the current account of the balance of payment is more serious problem for an economy. So in this question, we're looking at, talk about the cost of inflation. Cost of inflation क्या क्या होती है? Shoe leather cost, menu cost, redistribution cost, balance of payment problems, and uncertainty. Talk about why deficit on the current account is a big problem. Number one, because reserves may run down. Like in Pakistan case, reserves are low, borrowing may increase, and the high level of borrowing means reliance on others. Also, high level of borrowing basically means your economic sovereignty may get questioned, and we end up doing what we call expenditure dampening policies, which are contractionary fiscal and monetary policy, which can harm the economy in terms of higher unemployment. So you can talk about both of them are issues that are serious problems, and then they say which one is more of a serious problem. Here you can talk about that both inflation and current account deficit, because you remember we talked about how inflation can lead to current account deficit. So while I control current account deficit, I need to control both of these things, because inflation can cause current account deficit to happen as well, which means that I can't really choose between. We have to basically make sure we keep inflation low, and that can also in turn keep our current account deficit problem to be resolved. Make sense? So that's a fairly straightforward question. You need to remember the cost of inflation, you need to remember causes of current account deficit or consequences of current account deficit. Okay, so that's your first page, more or less. I want to move on to the next page. Is there any question before we move on? Yes? This one, using diagrams, explains the difference between demand pull and cost push. This is June 14. This is easy. Talk about demand pull and cost push. The only thing that I want to talk about demand pull is just that you talk about how AD can go up because any rise in C, I, G or X minus M will cause AD to go up. But if this is a punchline that you need to remember, if the economy doesn't have the spare capacity to meet the increased demand, ये line आपको लिखना must है that AD goes up. For example, if AD goes up like this one, right? AD goes up. In this case, economy doesn't have the spare capacity, and that's why inflation is happening. So that's something which you need to talk about. So any rise in C, I, G or X minus M will cause AD to go up, but if the economy doesn't have the spare capacity to meet the increased demand, that's when the price level goes up. And cost push inflation can happen because of wage push, tax push, profit push, and imported inflation. So talk about four, five factors and draw the two diagrams. When they say diagram versus diagrams का मतलब है they are asking for two or more. Normally two is what they ask for, versus diagram, one diagram is needed. Okay, distinguish between domestic and external consequences of inflation. This is easy. You talk about your menu cost, shoe leather cost, redistribution cost, the lenders lose out and all that. Then there is uncertainty, and then there is X minus M. Talk about how these two could be external as well as domestic, but these first three are domestic. And which one is the bigger problem? And the answer is it depends on basically how much of your trade happens or how much of your GDP rely upon foreign sector. If you're China, you would basically be much concerned about inflation effect on your trade. Make sense? So it all depends on the percentage of GDP that comes from foreign trade. However, it can affect both domestic and international, but which is most damaging to our economy? And the answer is basically it depends on your percentage of GDP coming from the foreign sector, or how reliant are you on foreign sector. If you are, then you want to keep inflation low for your competitiveness to remain. Okay. Then I want to talk about this one, which is to do with exchange rates. Show how exchange rates are determined in a free-floating exchange rate system, and explain how a high rate of inflation can lead to depreciation. This is easy. When the price level goes up, exports become expensive, imports become cheaper, and that basically causes demand for exports to fall, and demand for pounds to fall. Given because price of exports is going up, quantity of exports will fall, and if elastic, then export expenditure will fall. Similarly, import expenditure will go up. So demand for pounds will fall, supply of pounds will rise, and that will cause the exchange rate to fall. So we talk about in a free floating exchange rate, the exchange rate is determined through the market forces demand and supply. You talk about any change in demand and supply can change the exchange rate. Then we talk about inflation. What is inflation? Rising price level, which can a rise in price level can cause exports to become expensive, imports to become cheaper. X will fall, M will rise, given, you need to write this for sure, given elastic in nature, and that will cause this diagram to happen. So this is my US value of pounds, quantity of pounds. This is our demand and supply. So demand is going down from D0 to D1. Supply is going up from S0 to S1. And ultimately our exchange rate will fall from E0 to E1. So a rise in price level will cause exchange rate in an economy to go down. Make sense? Okay. Now, one thing that I want you guys to prepare really well is basically advantages and disadvantages of floating exchange rate, and advantages and disadvantages of high versus low exchange rate. Can you guys make sure you do that? Rat ke jana hai. It's all memorization basically. Advantages, disadvantages of free versus fixed exchange rate, and advantages and disadvantages of strong versus weak exchange rate. Okay, so I'm going to discuss this quickly. Free versus floating exchange rate right now. This of floating versus disadvantage. So in a floating exchange system, the first thing we say this that. So let's talk about advantages of floating. So first advantage of floating is basically because we are in a fixed exchange rate system, interest rates are used to manage exchange rate. So in a floating exchange rate system, basically interest rates are free to be used for any macro goal. You don't need to worry about not using interest rates, so your monetary policy is kind of like more flexible. You don't need to worry about in a free floating exchange rate about using interest rates only as a means to manage our exchange rate. You can use it for any goal. If your AD is going down, reduce interest rates so that you can make the AD go up. If your unemployment is going down, make the AD go up through interest rates. If inflation is happening, increase interest rate to control inflation. Makes sense? So you are free to use your interest rates for any policy goal, number one. Number two, we say this that in a floating exchange rate, because your current account, let me write this, current account balances itself. We saw this that if, for example, let me write this, you can talk about that if, for example, X minus M is going down. Then what happens when the X minus M is going down? Because X minus M, there is a deficit, your exchange rate will fall. When there's a fall in exchange rate, what happens to exports? Exports become cheaper, imports become expensive, and that will make my X minus M to automatically recover. So when you have a free floating exchange rate, current account may balance itself automatically because a deficit will make the exchange rate fall. An exchange rate fall would mean exports become cheaper, imports become expensive, X minus M can automatically recover. Theoretically, we say that's what happened. Number 3 is basically reserves are not needed to manage exchange rate. So you don't need to worry about reserves as a sort of way to manage exchange rate. So that's a big thing that you worried always. Like in Pakistan's case, Pakistan is kind of like managing its exchange rate. That's why for it, reserve matter. If it was a free floating exchange rate, reserves may not be a concern too much. Number 1. Okay, what are the disadvantages? Number 1 is speculation can happen because your floating exchange rate, people can speculate and that can basically cause uncertainty to happen. Who are speculators? Speculators are those who can buy low and sell high, and they can manipulate your currency by buying and selling your currency, number 1. Number 2 is that there is also uncertainty that happens in a floating exchange rate because what we say, uncertainty because of exchange rate risk. If I'm a producer, there is a business risk because I'm selling it to the international market, but there's an exchange rate risk. What if suddenly exchange rate appreciate? My exports will become expensive. Will people buy from me? And the answer is no. So there is also an exchange rate risk that happens in a free floating exchange rate that is seen. Number 3, there is a lack of discipline. What is the lack of discipline? We've seen this in a free floating exchange rate. You don't worry about inflation much because in a fixed exchange rate, inflation has a harmful effect because once inflation happens and you are unable to control it, your exports will become expensive, your current account will go in a deficit. In a free floating exchange rate, because you don't need to worry about your inflation too much, you may end up causing what we call policies which are not good in controlling inflation. Like China has a fixed exchange rate regime and they have a very strong control over inflation. While US, because they don't have a fixed exchange regime, they do not have inflation sort of controls, and they end up causing basically losing competitiveness to other countries which otherwise have a low inflation. So the fact that you have an exchange rate that is fixed sometimes put a lot of discipline which is lacking in a free floating exchange rate. Okay, so that's your answer for this one, which is advantages or disadvantages of floating. Consider whether on balance it is preferred to have a fixed system, and the answer is that probably fixed has its own challenges. In balance, one could actually argue to have a managed float, which is the best of both worlds. Wherever there is higher than sort of required exchange rate fluctuation, then only you intervene. Otherwise, let it be free floating. Okay. This is another discussion I want to quickly have. How a fall in exchange rate can cause both demand pull and cost push. So when the exchange rate goes down, how can it cause demand pull? Well, exchange rate goes down, exports become cheaper, imports become expensive. So X minus M can go up, which can make the AD go up. So that's where the demand pull inflation happens. Make sense? Where exports become cheaper, imports become expensive. Again, I'm assuming Marshall-Lerner condition is true, which means X minus M is elastic in nature. Okay? How does it cause cost push inflation? Well, when the price PM is going up, right, then if key inputs are imported, then that could result in cost of production to go up and aggregate supply to fall. So this is your demand pull and this is your cost push. And you need to make two diagrams. Either आप दिखाओगे AD गिर रहा होगा, you want to show your AD is going up, either you showing AS is going down. Okay? So inflation can, both demand pull and cost push inflation can happen because of a fall in exchange rate. Okay? We know this part. Discuss the use of supply side policy means to solve the problem of inflation. So I'm going to skip this question. Are we good to move on? Yep. Am I going in an okay pace? It's fine. Then comes this part, which is completely different topic, which is basically international trade. The difference in the way tariff and quotas operate as a method of production, and then advantages and disadvantages of free trade. B part is easy. I wanted to sort of quickly, because it came in November 18, variant 1, I just had a feeling that we should revise tariffs and quotas. So let me do that. That's the last part that we want to discuss. So let's quickly discuss tariffs and quotas. So guys, I didn't write a question about strong versus weak exchange rate. But in one of the papers, I think June, it came in data response as last part. So I feel it's an important topic to prepare, strong versus weak exchange rate, okay? It's very easy discussion, okay? Do prepare that. Okay, so what about tariff versus quota? What are tariffs? Tariffs are taxes. So we make this diagram for tariffs. Like if this is my demand and supply, and this is world price, right? This is supply, or world supply as we call it, world supply. Right now, Q2 minus Q1 is imported. So when the world price is lower than the domestic price, then you import Q2 minus Q1. If you are unhappy with this level of imports, then you put what we call a tariff. A tariff is a tax on import. A tariff results in the supply curve to shift upward. So world price will become PW ke bajaye PW dash, right? When you do so, there will be lower level of imports, Q4 minus Q3. So this becomes what we call the new level of imports. What was the previous level of imports? Q2 minus Q1. So this is after tariff. What's the impact of this? Well, because when you put tariff, the world price goes up. As a result of this, you will see the consumer surplus will go from A, B, PW to A, X, Y, which means area 1, 2, 3, 4 will be a loss of consumer surplus, which you just need to talk about because this is an 8-mark question where area 3 is what? Government, tariff, revenue. So you got to remember that as government, tariff, revenue. Makes sense? When you put a tag. On the other hand, a quota, are we going to move on? Questions? Yeah. What happens in a quota? A quota is a physical limit which will restrict supply. Okay. So यहाँ पे क्या था? You had complete supply. So let me just go to make a new diagram of quota. So in a quota, what happens is a physical limit. So in a quota, basically, it's slightly complicated as a diagram. Let's say this was your world supply, PW, and it was unrestricted, basically trade happening. Now you say only these guys are allowed. I'm sorry. Now you say only these guys are allowed and some more from the international market. Free trade nahi hai. If this was like previously 200, this was like 50. How many cars were imported? 150. Now you say only 50 will be imported, which would mean you restrict supply. New supply curve will become S0 plus quota. This will be my new supply curve, S0 plus quota. And that quota is how much? This gap is 50 cars. So you said these domestic producers will make plus 50 more. As a result, now the price will be here. Let's call it PQ for quota. Okay? Which would mean the price goes up, the quantity will fall to Q4. How much is imported? Q4 minus Q3, which is basically this horizontal gap is what we call quota. इधर क्या हो रहा है? इधर भी आपके पास area 1, 2, 3, 4 is what we call loss of consumer surplus. Previously A, B, PW was the consumer surplus. Now A, X, Y is the new consumer surplus. But area 3 in this case is basically increase in importers' revenue. The only difference between a quota and a tariff is that area 3 in quota goes to the importer who gets a better price. Like अगर दुनिया में आपकी जो है वो टोयोटा बिक रही है $50,000 की, I don't know, $10,000 की, in Pakistan it will be sold for PQ price $15,000. The 5,000 is the extra revenue that you get. Got it? So this comes in MCQs as well. Area 3 in a quota is a importer's revenue, while area 3 in a tariff is basically government tax revenue. Q4 minus Q3 is 50. Yeah, this vertical, this horizontal distance is 50 quantity. Okay, guys, does that make sense? So strong versus weak exchange rate, tariff quota कर लिया हमने. Pros and cons of international trade करने की ज़रूरत तो नहीं है. Do you want me to revise that? I have time. Do you want me to revise that? No? Sure? Yes. I thought you guys would say no. Okay, what about the pros and cons of, basically what are the reasons of, you need to know quickly, you need to know reasons of protection. Okay, number one is infant industry argument. The only thing that you need to mention is just that infant industry argument argues just that you need to basically put tariffs or quotas so that industries which are new can gain comparative advantage. You're assuming they have a what we call a potential comparative advantage, which means abhi nahi hai, but you can get comparative advantage. When you get comparative advantage later, you can reduce or remove the tariffs and quotas. The only problem is just that industries keep on relying on these protection and they never become independent. Number two, if you end up protecting somebody who doesn't deserve it to start off with, then you are wasting resources. Number one. Number two, reasons of protection is basically what we call sunset industry, which means industries that are declining and you are doing only because you are protecting jobs. What's the counter argument to this? Well, the counter argument to this is that what if other countries retaliate? Retaliation from other countries will mean one sector will gain, other sector will lose out. Let's say Pakistan protected its textile industry and Sri Lanka, knowing that Pakistan is now protecting its textile industry, they decide to protect their, for example, plastic industry, and we buy plastic from Sri Lanka or whatever. So, I mean, I don't know. So while you're protecting ours, they will protect theirs, and ultimately there won't be much of a gain. Also, when you protect one set of, like when you're protecting jobs, you're protecting firms, but consumers may end up paying a high price. Okay. Number three is dumping. Dumping is when you're selling below cost of production. We say that's a valid reason for protection. Why are you dumping? Number one, you have produced too much and you can't sell it. And number two, you're dumping because you want to destroy the local industry. Both of these reasons are reasons why trade protection is justified. So there's no counter argument. Number four is you want to make your current account deficit to go up, so X minus M to improve. We say that it is fine to do so, but these policies, the protection cannot solve the problem. You need to gain comparative advantage. So you need to focus on comparative advantage. This brings us to what are, these are the four reasons for protection. Quickly, I want to also, now that you guys have made me sort of revise, can I quickly revise strong versus weak exchange rate? Can I do strong versus weak exchange rate? Let's say a 5-minute discussion about strong versus weak exchange rate. So what are the advantages of strong currency? Number one is basically when your exchange rate goes up, we know this, that exports become expensive, imports become cheaper, so your X minus M goes down, so AD goes down, which means lower demand pull inflation. Also, when the imports are becoming cheaper, cost of production may go down, aggregate supply curve will shift to the right, and therefore lower cost push. So first big advantage of strong exchange rate is the idea that inflation will be low. Number one. Number two is because imports are becoming cheaper, you can buy more foreign goods, and that means your standard of living can also go up. Why? Because now you're buying cheaper foreign goods which otherwise were expensive, which would mean you can have a higher standard of living because of that. Also, when your exchange rate is high, it makes domestic producer sort of suffer, and the producer may strive to become more efficient. So the idea is this, that the pressure on prices will make him probably a better producer. And the fourth one is basically terms of trade may go up, because when the price of exports become expensive, as exchange rate goes up, it can make and by the way, imports become cheaper, terms of trade is basically PX over PM. PX is going up, PM is going down, so terms of trade will go up. And if terms of trade goes up, will the balance of trade go up? Depends on elasticity. So you can say this, that if inelastic, even balance of trade will go up. So that's what we need to talk about. Okay, what are the cons or disadvantages of exchange rate going up? Number one is domestic industry suffers. Why? Because imports are becoming cheaper. Number two, your export industry suffer. Why? Because exports are becoming expensive. Number three, unemployment will go up as X minus M goes down, and that can cause GDP of the economy to fall. So there is a possibility of AD going down and economy suffering from recession. It can slow down economy and make them suffer in terms of recession. Yes, Paul? Because when the exchange rate goes up, your AD curve is shifting backward. If X minus M goes down, that can make your economy to suffer economically. Got it?